I thought I'd just do a quick bonus video because I was invited to the National Farmers Union Conference in London, and I drew two conclusions from it that I wanted to share with you. Firstly, that I think the current Labour government are further to the political right concerning the food system than the last Conservative administration were. And secondly, because of that, they are wrong, which is something I want to illustrate briefly by talking about Vikings. Steve Reed, the Minister for the Countryside, attended the conference and gave a speech that contained lots of inconsequential positive things and then got rinsed by the audience in the questions. The audience were very good. And we'll start with that. So this is a question to the Minister from a chap called David Passmore, who's asking about his mother and those in a similar situation who, in order to keep the family farm intact, will have to not be alive when the inheritance tax changes come into force in a little over a year. And imagine that you're in the audience here, as I was, and you have to listen to a Minister of State dodge the question, but implicitly between the lines say there is a financial black hole to fill. If there are civilian deaths as collateral damage, that's acceptable, and he won't do anything to avoid it.
David Passmore.
Secretary of State, many people are caught up in the middle of his inheritance tax change. This includes my mother, an active farmer of 90, from a family of over 400 years of continuous farming labours, and a widow of over 20 years now wishing her life away ahead of April next year. Her and countless other widows and widowers are now in a similar position where the best tax advice is to ensure they are not here by April next year. What do you say to her?
Well, first of all, I'm really sorry about the individual circumstances. Genuinely and truly, I'm very, very sorry to hear that. But it's very difficult for me as Secretary of State to comment on individual circumstances. I can't do that. But I've explained to you why we had to take a decision that I know has been very, very difficult. But we will focus in the future on making farmers more profitable. Because that seems to me...
Profitability won't help these people. And you say 7 years, they haven't got 7 years. An uplift in farm profits won't stop some of these people thinking of doing the unthinkable. It won't. It's just nonsense.
I hear what you're saying, but I genuinely can't comment on individual circumstances.
No,
what about the
people
principle then of people, many people who are in the same position as David's mum, when if they die before next April, they will feel that's doing their family a favour, brutally.
Well, again, I'm not going to.
Surely there's a mechanism.
I'm not going to comment on circumstances like that. I mean, the fact
and
is,
you're not
you're acknowledging that these people are just a bit of friendly fire, collateral damage of tax policy. That is appalling.
Even despite the changes. I fully understand that there's anger about the decision, but even despite that, where the decision is...
For last week's Secretary of State, we offered a solution to your government that still raises the money, that takes all of those people out of the eye of this storm. The very fact that government are not listening... That is really tough.
So, okay, these people wishing their lives away, just take it on the chin, there's a black hole.
Nobody should wish their lives away.
Yeah.
Nobody should wish their lives away.
Well, they are as a result of your policies.
Nobody should.
But they are.
But there is no consideration of a way round that, a loophole, counting the 7 years as shorter if you're over a certain age.
The Chancellor announced the tax policy in the budget, and the Chancellor's been clear, as the government has been clear, the tax policies stand.
Just to emphasise briefly, the government's argument here doesn't add up because there are lots of ways they could tax land that would raise more money, like a clawback on the inheritance tax reliefs after a farm is sold. This would allow continuing businesses to continue and wouldn't cause premature civilian deaths. And this is what the NFU president Tom Bradshaw proposed. Reed talked a lot about profit and about his experience in business, which didn't seem very Labour Party to me. And he actually said that the previous Conservative government, who you would expect to be more business orientated, forgot that farmers are capitalists and that the countryside is a market.
And it is only by overcoming these long-standing challenges that we can create the conditions for your farming businesses to succeed. Achieving this starts by treating farms as the businesses they are. That's something, in my view, the previous government forgot. Farmers have repeatedly told me they want to stand on their own 2 feet. They are proud people, and rightly so. But it is paternalistic and patronising for government to treat farmers as if they are not operating in a marketplace in which they need to turn a decent profit. I worked in business for 16 years, with responsibility every year for driving up profits and driving down costs.
No talk of social responsibility there. And he also repeated his Conservative predecessor Michael Gove's line on public money for public goods. And he repeated the Conservative stance against temporary economic migrants, which I don't personally think was necessary. And I think actually, as Reid himself alluded to, the Labour Party seem more economically libertarian than the Conservatives did when they were in government. The Conservatives wanted the government to pay us for environmental services, which I don't agree with on many levels, but that is government intervention to provide something that a market won't. The government will fix market failure with subsidies and provide nature. Whereas Steve Reid was saying that we want or should want to be able to stand on our own 2 feet within a market economy.
British farming has some of the hardest working, most creative people anywhere in the British workforce. But a sector that isn't profitable doesn't have a future.
So it would seem to me that they're prepared to have some collateral, whether it's an old lady taking her own life or just the fat being cut from the bone of the rural economy. If you don't make enough money, there is no place for you in the future. That afternoon, we saw Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies reinforce this. He gave a lecture about economics. He talked a lot about those 2D economic metrics like growth and GDP, with an emphasis on the national bottom line. And he was concerned that growth in this country has flatlined in a way that we have never seen before.
So there's 2 lines here. One, the yellow line is what you see in the headlines, what's happening to national income. The green line is the one that matters, what's happening to national income per person. Now, we can grow national income just by having more people, and we have got a lot more people than we had 15 years ago. What matters for our incomes is what national income per person is. So you can see from the green line that it's about the same now as it was in 2019. It basically hasn't grown for 6 years. And you can see that's only about 5 or 6% bigger than it was back in 2008. That's the flip side of saying that average incomes, median earnings, are basically the same now as they were in 2008. Now, we have not seen a nearly 20-year period, 17-year period like that, well, certainly since Napoleon was trying to invade. I mean, that is the scale of how extraordinary this period has been.
Now, this is of course concerning, but he seemed to think it justified the breakup of farms because those farms are uneconomic.
Supposing you're a farm worth £4 million, this might result in a tax burden of £200,000 over 10 years. If you've got that level of capital, if you're really not making enough to pay £1,000 a month additional on that, then that is clearly a business that is not, it's incredibly uneconomic in the sense of the way that capital is generally spread across the economy. So if that is the case, then I suspect that will create quite a lot of turnover and turmoil in the farming market. In
his very limited defence here, he did say that he didn't know if his broader logic would apply in the countryside, but he said that generally speaking, multi-generational businesses become less efficient. So if they're broken up, he doesn't see that it would hurt the economy.
I don't know if there's evidence of this on farms, but I do know that there is evidence for small businesses that if you, or for businesses more generally, that those businesses that are run by second and third generation owners tend to be less efficient than other businesses. Partly maybe the second generation, third generation person is entrepreneurial, is the founder. Maybe they've got they're sort of taking it relatively easy because they've got the capital behind them. So I think there is a productivity argument against treating super generously.
I don't think this really applies to farming because it's such a long game. You learn from the older generation while the younger generation innovates. That's how farming families work. And if some farms are inefficient, it's hardly an excuse to clobber all of them with a tax that they can't afford to pay.
Do I think this will be economically damaging? It's not clear to me that it will be. Will it be really difficult for a group of people who have been used to something quite different? Yeah, of course it will be.
And on top of that, we've talked about the barriers to entry into farming, which are prohibitive. If you are to bankrupt all of the existing farmers, you're not going to get bright-eyed new entrants into the sector. The startup costs versus expected financial return just doesn't make sense. And Paul Johnson added that if a sector is to be treated differently within the economy, it must have a very good argument for that.
As an economist, I talk to sort of people from all parts of the economy. When I talk to people about education and about health and about defence and about justice and so on, and all of them think they've got the best possible argument for why they should get more money into their sector. I also talk to people from the pension sector, from big business, from small business, savers and so on, and all of them think that they're the ones that ought to get the tax breaks. And so I start from a position where you have to have a pretty strong argument for treating one group differently for tax than other groups. And of course, if one group pays less tax, then another group pays more tax. So starting point, why treat inheritance of farms any different from inheritance of houses and so on?
The argument I would make here is that health is about nutrition and nutrition is about food. Paul Johnson talked extensively about the enormous cost of healthcare to the taxpayer in this country, but agricultural policy needs to be seen as part of that. And after the Second World War it was, which is why we have the cheap food policy. Reading between the lines, I think the logic is that farmers could make a lot of money from our land if we took contracts for solar panels on it, or did carbon offsetting or whatever, which would mean more money was moving around and that would produce growth. But farmers generally aren't doing that because we believe in the social value of food and we are therefore holding back growth in the abstract two-dimensional sense. This is therefore a problem and we must be removed from the land so corporate-minded people can make lots of money, because that will make this line go up, and that apparently is all the government can see. After the conference, I had a conversation with someone who's been involved in the negotiations with the Treasury, and they said that the problem is that the people who run the government have a worldview that simply doesn't include sole traders. Their world is all about the government and corporations and lobbyists and media. A farmer who owns his own land is invisible to them. So it isn't that they're attacking us, per se. They just don't see us. They don't understand us. And therefore a farm is not working capital that's required to continue a business. It is a personal asset storing wealth, and we are investors, which is why the 20% tax on farms is generous compared to the 40% tax everyone else has to pay. They see us as investors getting an easy deal because that's the world they live in. And then, through some bizarre twist of fate, later in the evening I ended up in a pub talking to a civil servant at the Treasury who was very unsympathetic to us for exactly this reason. We're getting a better deal than most people, and if we can't pay it, it's because we're uneconomic, and that's our problem. We're getting an easy ride. We need to innovate like Steve Reed wants. We need to become more efficient like Paul Johnson suggested. But I can't help feeling that this worldview fundamentally misunderstands how economics, and particularly free market economics, works in the countryside. So we're going to talk about Vikings for a little bit, because if there's one thing the Vikings taught us, it's that being unprofitable doesn't mean that you're inefficient. In the early Middle Ages, there was the Kingdom of Wessex in what is now southern England, ruled by the Saxons, and it neighboured the Danelaw, which was controlled by the Danes, the Viking invaders. The Danes decided that rather than bother invading Wessex, they could just demand that the Saxon rulers paid them not to invade. These payments came to be called Danegeld, and from a Viking perspective they were great because they could rip all of the money out of Wessex without really doing anything. And this got really silly. In the year 991, the Saxons paid the Vikings £10,000 of silver. 3 years later, they paid £16,000 of silver. By the year 1006, the payment had risen to £36,000 of silver, and by 1012, it was £48,000 of silver. This was a very profitable arrangement for the Vikings. The point here is that Wessex was not doing too well financially, but in order to pay these huge and ever-increasing sums of money, it had to develop a really efficient bureaucracy to collect the tax. So because of this, England in the Middle Ages had a remarkably centralised and highly developed system of government. And it was efficient because they had no money. They had to become efficient or risk losing the kingdom to Viking invasion. And we see a very similar principle in the relationship between supermarkets and dairy farmers, say. Farmers don't set the price for their commodities. The prices are dictated to them in contracts, often in quite unfair circumstances, and then they have to adapt to that price level, else they risk going bankrupt and losing the business. This is what happened to us when we milked cows. We'd sign a milk contract, which was often very low to start with, and then we'd get a letter telling us that they were changing the contract that we'd already signed, and we'd be getting less money, and we would have to deal with that. As with Wessex, this meant that we didn't have very much money, but it meant that we became very efficient. We got very good at producing lots of high-quality milk very, very cheaply, because if we couldn't do that, we would have been bankrupted. And this is what I feel Paul Johnson and Steve Reed don't understand. They say there is no place in their future for uneconomic businesses, and that includes farms, but they're forgetting that making money is quite often something that is entirely outside of our power. We have to take the prices that are set either by the market for a commodity or that are dictated to us by processing companies. And what we need to fix that is government intervention and regulation of the supermarkets, not a free market economy, which is where these guys seem to be heading. Farming famously doesn't do very well in a free market economy because it means the supermarkets are free to do whatever they want to us, which means forcing us beneath the cost of production until we go bankrupt, and then at that point just importing food. And if we're to continue this analogy where the farmers are poor little Wessex being extorted by the aggressive, big, powerful companies who are the Vikings, that story ended with Wessex not existing because it was ultimately conquered by the Viking King Canute. So what I take from this is that bizarrely the Labour government are more in favour of a free market countryside than the Conservatives were. At best, the former Conservative government repealed the socialist cheap food policy, and then this Labour administration is not only continuing their reforms but accelerating them, removing the basic payments faster than was agreed. To me, this would put them at the same end of the political spectrum but more extreme. They're doing the same stuff but faster than the Conservatives did. This annoyed me enough that I got this quote in The Independent. The problem fundamentally in British agriculture at the moment is the agricultural transition, which was the brainchild of Conservative Michael Gove. But in a bizarre lapse of ideological direction, the new Labour government has doubled down on it. This is absurd. No one in the Labour Party should agree with Michael Gove on anything, really. If Liz Truss stood up and said she wanted a free market countryside, I would think that that was at least ideologically consistent, as much as I would disagree with it. I understand that she did want to do that while she was the minister at DEFRA, but she didn't. But the Labour Party seem to be laying the groundwork for this. They are incorrectly equating profitability and efficiency and saying that all of these businesses must be consigned to history. And if there are suicides in the process, then that's unfortunate for the families. The effects of this are that we will lose the control of our own food supply, we will be completely at the mercy of global shocks, and inevitably our food standards will decline with substandard imports, which will impact the health of the working people and put more strain on the National Health Service and therefore the taxpayer. Where is the joined-up thinking? Where is the left-wing food policy? The people who voted Labour in the last election didn't want a continuation of what the Conservatives were doing, but in the agricultural sector, that is exactly what Steve Reed is giving us. Actually, he's accelerating it and delivering it with even less warmth. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Do let me know what you think, and I will be back in just a couple of days to talk about food security, because as uneconomic as it may be, we all need to eat. Godspeed you.